Welcome to the MindSea podcast series, Moving Digital Health. Our guest today is Ruby Gadelrab Tudor. Ruby is a seasoned commercial health executive who has over 20 years of experience in biotech, healthcare, and health tech industries, including extensive experience working with startups. She is the CEO and co-founder of MDisrupt, which is building the world's first platform for connecting clinicians and scientists with digital health companies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ruby.
It's a pleasure, Ruben. Delighted to be here.
Do you mind giving us a brief overview of your background to start?
Yes. So my background, I have spent over 26 years commercializing health products. And my origin story is that I am the daughter of two amazing doctors, which made me not want to be one because they are massively underappreciated and work so hard. So I decided to study molecular biology and genetics instead. And I was not the best scientist in the world either. So I went to the dark side and went commercial immediately. And so I spent the first 10 years of my career in the UK, in Europe, commercializing various life sciences tools. And then about 17 years ago, I moved over to Silicon Valley, California, where I spent the last period of my career doing the same. And I moved in 2012 from life sciences and switched over to the early digital health companies such as Invitae and 23andMe. So that's kind of my background.
Excellent. And what inspired you to start MDisrupt?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I was living in Silicon Valley at the time. And after commercializing many life sciences and health products over my career, to me, it's become a formula. You do certain things in a certain order, and you are able to get widespread adoption and scale. And if you skip a few steps, it's a lot harder to do that. So I was living in Silicon Valley at the time. I had been working at 23andMe as the VP of commercial marketing. And at the time, there were a ton of new digital health startups starting up. And many of them were making these amazing consumer products, really amazing consumer experiences, ways to engage consumers, but they weren't products that could be actually adopted into the healthcare system. They weren't things that a physician could use, a clinician could use, a health system could adopt, or a payer could pay for. And so I was off as a B2B commercialization expert. I was often called into these companies as an advisor to help them when they wanted to make the pivot from direct to consumer into some of the B2B healthcare. So I decided to leave 23andMe and go and help some of these companies full time. And I consulted for about 25 of them back to back in 2.5 years. And I learned so much. So the first thing I learned is that the folks who are building these companies, the health innovators, are some of the most talented, passionate people in the world. So that was the very first learning. Second thing, they had amazing access to capital. Third thing, many of them had never actually built and scaled a health product before, right? And then the fourth thing is, as I looked around their teams, very few of them had clinical or regulatory experts within their teams. And quite frankly, that's pretty normal. If you're starting a company, you usually start it with folks that you know and you've worked with before, and because they hadn't done it, they didn't have that network on hand. So the market insight, if you like, Ruben, was that if the future innovators of healthcare were going to come from outside the healthcare world, how do we bring the clinical experts to help them in a quick, seamless, easy way? And so that was kind of the very beginnings and the inception of MDisrupt.
Excellent. And so how does MDisrupt connect clinicians and scientists with digital health companies?
So think of us as a health expert marketplace. On one side, we have clinicians and regulatory people and scientists and data analysts and product leads. Everybody has had 10 years or more experience in building, commercializing healthcare products. And on the other side, you have the health technology companies, and these could be startups or they could be some of the larger tech companies who are getting into healthcare. And so what we do is we help them find the several different types of experts. Operators on demand is the first one. So if you need a fractional chief medical officer, but you can't afford a $300,000, $400,000 salary, how do you get one day a week to help you, right? For a year or so until you can get to your MVP and figure out that you are actually solving a clinical problem. Or if you need to do a regulatory submission for your product, how do you get a regulatory expert for 3-4 months to help you figure out your regulatory strategy and then work with whichever regulatory body that you are going after? So that's kind of at a high level what we do is the operators on demand, and all our folks are deep experience, and they go into the companies and they actually do the stuff, right? It's not just strategy and advice. On the other side, we also have over 600 clinicians in our network. We cover 25 medical disciplines, and these clinicians are super engaged and really interested in being part of digital health innovation. And so these folks want to do a couple of different things. They want to be medical advisors for companies, and building a medical advisory board for a company is a really good way to get multiple clinical voices in the company without necessarily a huge investment. So the clinicians want to be medical advisors. They want to be fractional chief medical officers and medical directors. And many of them are actually practicing, and they want to be the first to access innovation in their practices. So many of them participate in, product feedback and usability studies and figuring out things fit into clinical workflows. So we make that connection, and then we take care of all of the things that the experts don't like taking care of for themselves. So we take care of contracting and payment and liability insurance, rate negotiations. So that's really what we do at a very, very high level.
Yeah, because I'm thinking I don't know a lot of clinicians that have a lot of free time on top of their day job. But it sounds like the group you're working with is just so passionate about technology and advancing the field that they just want to be part of the innovation.
Well, interestingly enough, there's a few things there. So we see clinicians who want to be a clinician right? Clinician and something. And then separately, we see folks who are a little bit later on in their careers and they want to start, giving back to the new innovators. One of the things that I would also say is that clinicians, I think, can be the superpower or the secret sauce of many of these new digital health companies. And if you find the right clinicians and you give them a seat at the table and the voice in the process, it can save a company years of time and millions of dollars. And so again, lots of clinicians are looking for careers that are as well as their clinical practice. And quite frankly, some of them are actually a little bit fed up of some of the point solutions that are thrown at them within the system that they've never had an involvement in developing, right?
Yeah, they want to be part of solving their own problems on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so do you find sometimes connections go the other way as well, where you might have a physician entrepreneur that has that medical expertise, but doesn't have some of the other skills?
That's exactly right. And we're seeing that more and more these days of clinician entrepreneurs who are starting their own companies and, to your point, really want to be part of solving their own problem. And yes, so we focus on clinical experts, all commercial experts, and regulatory experts. So if a clinician entrepreneur is founding a company, we've often been called in to help them on the business side, on the regulatory side, and on the product side. So yes, we see the other side too. I'm putting together a digital health founders fellowship with Menlo Ventures, and it was a competition where we selected 30 digital health innovators. And of that 30 that we selected, 10 of them are actually clinician innovators. So we're seeing a lot more of that happening now.
Because they just have such a great perspective on the problems that need to be solved within the system. And especially whatever niche or specialty they're working in, just such a deep understanding of how that problem could be solved. but not necessarily the technical expertise. So we see that on our side as well. So at MindC, we work with a few different physicians that are building products that are scratching their own itch essentially, and so we help provide those technical and user experience design expertise to bring that product to life.
That's exactly right. And actually, it's funny because I often feel like the clinicians are almost like this superpower of the health system that's massively underutilized in industry, right? So to your point, they understand their experience. They're directly in touch with the patient experience. They understand what needs to happen in a clinical workflow, right? And so they have this really good depth of knowledge, and they also see the problems from the inside. They also understand what a viable solution would be. And so again, I do think that, health technology companies or health innovators should really tap into that knowledge and that resource. And likewise, how do we connect on the other side, which is the clinicians in with the business folks, in with the tech folks, in with the product leaders?
Exactly. So to leverage that clinician expertise as much as possible, with even a small amount of time can make a huge impact on a product or a team.
That's exactly right.
I'd love to dig into more to like what some of the reasons why healthcare startups struggle to get out the door. You mentioned some of the hurdles, but maybe we could get into that a bit deeper.
There are so so many things. So why do they struggle? Okay, so the first thing is really understanding the clinical problem that they're trying to solve, right? So oftentimes you see technology looking for a problem instead of here's a problem, what is a viable solution? And so that's one of the things that we see a lot of is, how are you actually solving a real clinical problem, a real pain point to the system? So that's the first thing. The second thing is healthcare is a regulated industry, right? And it's a regulated industry that requires a lot of data and evidence generation. And as I mentioned, many of the health innovators are trying to use tech tactics, right, to build and scale, right, which doesn't always work in healthcare. And so, we think about healthcare. Anyone who's in the healthcare profession has taken an oath of do no harm, whereas in tech, our oath is almost go fast and break things, right? And those two things are like completely opposed to each other. So at MDisrupt, our mantra about connecting the two is actually go fast responsibly. But the other thing is the level of evidence that needs to be generated, one, for regulatory purposes, and two, to make sure the solutions are safe and effective. The regulatory burden and the data generation burden is pretty high. And again, this is not something that you can just go and test and iterate in the market. This is something where you have to actually have done the studies. And if you're watching the industry right now, the biggest theme is about generating clinical outcomes, right? And how do you make sure that you're generating clinical outcomes? And then the biggest thing is that often companies have not thought about who is going to pay for this solution. And so healthcare is one of the complex industries because the user, the payer, and the consumer are not the same people, right? And they don't even have the same incentives. And so who are you designing for? Are you designing for a physician? Are you taking a payer into account? Are you thinking about how the patient's going to use it? And so these are things that are really, really complex. And so, I mean, those are just some of the struggles that some of these companies are experiencing. And I'm hoping that over time, the innovators in the space who are learning from the clinical folks and vice versa, these things will get it will be less of a mountain to climb.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think the procurement process with hospitals or larger organizations can take a long time, and again you have to have that evidence and data to back up, but sometimes you have a product, you just need to trial it to be able to in a small scenario to generate that data. So what are some of the ways that digital health startups can start to generate that data before having adoption at a hospital or, larger healthcare authority?
What I often tell health innovators is firstly start with the right regulatory strategy, right? Right regulatory strategy is what problem are you solving and for who and how, what is the claim that you are making, right? And often, entrepreneurs generally want to boil the ocean, right? And do something really, really broad. And in healthcare, and even just generally in entrepreneurship, like your goal is to solve a really small but painful problem, right? And so when you're thinking about regulatory strategy, that's the first thing. Like, it's called an intended use statement, which is who are you solving this problem for? And what is the evidence that you need to prove it? And then there's a bunch of studies that need to happen after that. So one is, does the product actually work compared to the standard of care, right? And that's often called a validation study. And the regulatory bodies need to see that whatever you're trying to disrupt, that your technology is actually doing the same or better, right? So that's the first study. The second study is like a clinical validation study, which is when you utilize your technology, does it pick up the disease or the risk when it's there, and does it not when it's not, right? So that's the second study. And then the third and fourth studies that you have to do are clinical outcomes. So have you tested this in a cohort of folks, right? And you can show that there is a change, a positive change in their health, in their health outcomes. And then the fourth one is around health economics. If you can make this change using this technology, fully loaded costs of implementation, does this save the health system money, or does it create a new revenue stream, right? And I hate to say it, but healthcare is a business, right? And it's a business. And so we have to think about how we can make products which have good health outcomes, but also have an economic value to whoever the payer is.
Mm-hmm. And so how does MDisrupt help companies that need to go through those stages of studies and help them through that process?
So we go at it in two different ways. So first is the expert network. So the expert network, we have every type of healthcare expert that you can use to get you through those studies. So we have the health economists, we have the data scientists, we have the lab scientists if you're developing a lab test, and we have the regulatory experts. So any expert that you need to build any of those types of studies, we can help you on that side. The second thing that we're doing, and this is kind of something we're doing a little bit more on the long term, is we're starting to look at companies and evaluate them for clinical outcomes, right? And the goal of doing that is to, I'll show you an example. Well, here is a lab test, right? And I bought this off the internet. Do you know if it's any good?
No, I see a label on there. It says, was it HbA1c test?
That's correct. Yeah. So where would you go to find out if it's any good?
Well, Google, I guess.
Exactly. So the fact that you and I are in this space and most people don't know if this is any good is actually a problem for all of healthcare. There are 300,000 digital health products on the market today, and we don't know. Providers don't know, clinicians don't know, health systems don't know, payers don't know. And so then when I say to folks, well, where would you go to find out? They all say exactly what you say, Dr. Google, right? Dr. Google is going to show you who's paying the most for search engine marketing and consumer reviews, right?
Yeah, so who has the best SEO strategy?
Exactly right. So where is that independent place that we as patients or clinicians or payers or employers can go to figure out if this product is any good clinically, right? I mean, here's another example. I'm wearing an Oura ring. I love my Oura ring, by the way. But what would a cardiologist think of this?
I don't know. I'm sure if you took, a room full of cardiologists, you'd have a whole bunch of different opinions on whether they enjoy hearing patients' reports of the data from their Oura ring or not.
And you know why? Because they haven't been involved in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when you're asking how we can help digital health companies, these are the ways that we can help them. One, we're looking at the outcomes of companies ourselves, so we can start to say, okay, here's a set of really great wearables, or here's a set of really great lab tests, or here's a set of really great genetic tests, right? And then we want to be able to help those companies get to the payers and to the health systems and to the employers. But also, if you don't have those, that evidence, how can we help you generate it by putting you with some clinicians that can give you the feedback that could potentially test it in their practices, right? So when we're building any tech product, we do a lot of user feedback. We give it to the users, we watch them use it, right? And we gather feedback and we fix what's broken. This is the way that we envisage helping digital health companies over the next few years, which is bring the PCP who's helping to monitor your activity to the table. Bring the cardiologist who cares about your HRV to the table. These are the things that we think we will be able to do over the next few years.
Yeah, and there's nothing more humbling than, watching a user try a product, be confused, and, if you were part of the design of putting that together, you're screaming inside, say, it's so obvious, just, click that next button. But when you see actual people in your target audience, maybe they have a medical condition, or watching them go through that process and getting that feedback can be so valuable. So it's that feedback from the end user. But like you said, there's so many different users in a digital health product. You need the feedback from all of those sides.
360, exactly. And then the other piece that's interesting is if you ever want to build a product that providers will actually adopt, one of the things that health technologists need to understand is that clinicians don't love to be marketed to. They're the world's most skeptical audiences, but they do like to listen to their peers, right? So, they'll ask their peer, up the hall, what product are you using for X, or what drug are you using for Y? And so that peer-to-peer marketing, if you like, holds way more value than if you're trying to, do a TikTok on social media, right? For example. And so the reason I share that is because if you are involving clinicians in the process of the development of the product, they can actually be your best advocates, right? They will tell their friends, and they will talk about it in conferences, and they will publish with it when they can. So it's literally using the clinicians not only to guide the product development, but also to be the mouthpiece for when a product's really, really good.
Yeah, your product champion or your early adopters are, often the best word of mouth possible.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So we both know it takes a long time for a digital health company to go from idea to study to validation and launching adoption of a product. With the changing landscape in the venture capital, do you see that affecting a lot of the digital health companies, or because of the extended timelines, venture for digital health is already thinking 5 to 10 years and not as reactionary to short-term changes?
I think the industry has learned a lot over the last 5 years. We have learned so much on the founder side and on the investor side, and on the healthcare side too. So let's start with each of them separately. So in healthcare feels like it was slow and resistant to digital health innovation for so long. And then the pandemic came along, and the pandemic showed us that these aren't just novelty health tools, right? These became our healthcare tools when we were in lockdowns and when we had to deliver care to patients in their home. So there was a rapid adoption of healthcare tools. So for example, telemedicine has been around for about 15 years, right? And it hasn't been massively adopted in healthcare until the pandemic. And part of the reason wasn't actually people just being resistant to it, as in clinicians being resistant to it, is also that it wasn't reimbursed, right? And so the pandemic showed us this massive willingness and ability to adopt digital health technologies. So to me, that has become testament that these technologies are not just random technologies sitting out there. They are the healthcare products of our future. So that's the first kind of change that we've seen in the last 5 years. The second thing is on the investor side. So on the investor side, 4 or 5 years ago, when I used to talk to investors and I used to talk about, well, where's the evidence and where's the clinical outcomes? This wasn't language that was in their vernacular, right? And it wasn't language that was in their vernacular because lots of them came from the tech world, and they were now investing in healthcare, which is the next, huge market ripe for disruption. And I think that has really changed over the last 5 years, where we have seen so much investment that has gone into digital health companies, with so few of them that have actually scaled. And then the final group is on the founders, on the entrepreneurs themselves. Many of the founders and the entrepreneurs, 5-10 years ago, were on their first go at it. Now, many of them have built companies, either exited them or sunsetted them, and they've learned and they've understood the process, and now they're on their second go at it. And so they understand what needs to be done. And so I think, as entrepreneurs, the guidance I would say is pick the investors wisely, the investors who understand the realistic time horizon for scale. And on the investor side, I would say, make sure that you're funding companies who are thinking about their evidence generation and their regulatory strategy from day one. And on the healthcare side, I would say, we need to take more calculated risks, from a perspective of, we didn't have to do all this in a rush because of the pandemic. We could have been doing this years and years before, but every now and then you need something to accelerate the adoption, and that was it for us.
Okay. Great background. And I'm wondering if we could go back to MDisrupt, the founding, when you first started out. I'm sure there's lots of lessons you've learned over the last few years as well. So what advice would you offer those looking to develop a startup who are right at the beginning stage of their product?
So that is a great question. So I took a little bit of an untraditional path, and I think some of the things I did were, I would go back and I'd do them again. And some of the things I have learned so much and I would do completely differently. So the first thing that I did that I think helped is I bootstrapped the company for 2 years. I had an incredible small team, and we all worked really closely together, and we bootstrapped for the first couple of years. And we managed to bootstrap, and we did everything on spreadsheets and Post-it notes and Airtables. And what we managed to do is get as soon as we had generated about $5 million in revenue in total, we said, okay, this is we have service market fit. Now let's go and raise money, right? So that was the first thing. We kind of proved out some marketplace dynamics, and we were able to prove out that experts wanted to be engaged with digital health companies, and we knew how to attract them, and we knew the things that we needed to do for them in order to make them successful. And we knew on the other side, from the client side, that there was a need for the clients to be able to get fractional talent to build their MVPs too. So that was kind of one of the first things I would say is, as a founder, get some traction, right? Get some traction, prove your service market fit, and then do your product market fit. Because we spent 2 years talking to the customers and doing everything manually, we didn't build anything immediately, right? So we learned really deeply what the customer problem was, how we needed to solve it, and some of the friction points that they experienced through the process. And those are all the learnings that we start to put into our product as soon as we started on the engineering side. So that was the second thing, is, really talk to your users early and often. The other thing I learned is that when you are fundraising, it's really wise to get to know investors a year before you need to raise, right? There's a spectrum of investors. There's some really amazing, incredible ones. And you have to be a thesis fit for them, meaning they want to invest in companies that solve the problems that you're solving. And that is a really hard thing for very first time founders to understand. not every no is a no. Sometimes it's just not a thesis fit. Sometimes it's not a stage fit, right? These are things you need to kind of learn before you seriously begin fundraising. So that's the second major learning, I would say, is really get to know investors and understand the different phenotypes before you start fundraising. And then the third thing is really understand who's going to pay for your product and what their price tolerances and what your pricing strategy is going to be. And sometimes you're going to be testing in market, but that's a really important point. Is I see a lot of companies, they start building innovations and going direct to consumer, and they get some initial traction, and then they realize how expensive consumer acquisition is, and they want to go B2B, right? And when they want to go B2B, they have to backtrack because often the consumer product isn't suitable for a healthcare system, right? So these are all kind of learnings that I see, not just in my own experience, but in the companies that we see at MDisrupt too.
Certainly some sound advice there. So looking forward on the roadmap of MDisrupt, what do you see in the future of, how your organization might change and grow?
So we have built what I believe to be the industry's most robust health expert network. And that's kind of where we started. But and that's a really important part of what we do, because we're able to put, as I mentioned, the clinical, commercial, regulatory experts into these companies and really help them. But the next iteration of what we would like to do is we want to help the companies more deeply on the evidence generation side. And ultimately, we want to organize the world's digital health products by clinical outcomes. And when we're doing that organization of the products by clinical outcomes, we want to be able to find the really good ones and be the conduit for these companies to go to the health systems and the payers and the employers. So really the mission is to get the most impactful health products to patients quickly. And how do we do that? Well, one, help the companies build better products. Two, organize the world's digital health products by performance. And then three, be able to take the great ones and make sure that the payers and the employers and the health systems and the providers know what they are. So that's kind of my 3-step future plan.
Excellent. Certainly there is a need for that, evaluation of the tools or what's out there. And making it easy for clinicians or healthcare providers to find tools that are the right fit, that have proven outcomes, and can make a difference in their platform. Zooming out to the digital health industry as a whole, what do you see as some of the big developments that are coming in the next few years?
I can't go without saying that the rhetoric for this year is all about clinical outcomes. You see it everywhere, right? So everybody cares more deeply about this. How do we, and this is from a payer's perspective, from a health system perspective, and from an investor perspective. So a big focus on clinical outcomes is one of the things. The second thing that we see a lot of focus on is things like women's health. Massively underserved market for so many decades, in fact, forever. And we're seeing a massive resurgence in companies that are trying to solve different stages of women's health. Traditionally in women's health, a lot of the problems have been focused around pregnancy and fertility. But cardiovascular disease is one of the biggest killers of women. Where is the focus on cardiovascular disease in women? Menopause is a very interesting life stage, right? World doesn't even know how to reimburse for a life stage, right? So there's so much work to be done on the women's health stuff. I think we can all see that, the pandemic took its toll on the world's mental health and access to easy mental health programs and solutions. That's another huge area that we're seeing. But the future of healthcare is actually at home. It's in the home, and it's where people live and where people work. So again, we're going to see a lot more solutions in healthcare in the home and things like remote patient monitoring. And so there's where I see the big trends, and I'd love to talk again in about 5 years and see if I was right.
Well, I'm sure you're on the right track there. It's the time in between you go and see a clinician for 20 minutes, and then maybe you don't see them for another 4 weeks. It's all that time in between to give patients the tools to help them manage their own condition, put the self-care in their hands with the remote patient monitoring and support tools. So 100%, that's a huge trend, and we see that with some of the products we're working with as well.
That's exactly right. And healthcare is, again, changing from this episodic experience when you're sick to this continual experience about like keeping you healthy, maintaining your health, detecting things when they go wrong early. And the only way to be able to do that is to create products that support that thesis.
Exactly, and that leads to increased testing as well. So if you're trying to catch things early, there's more testing, more data, more diagnostics being gathered at the early stages to help inform and keep people out of the hospital.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining me on the podcast, Rui. I love what you're doing at MDisrupt to connect digital health companies with experts. And thank you to everyone else who's listening on Moving Digital Health. If you enjoyed this conversation, please go to movingdigitalhealth.com to subscribe to the MindC newsletter and be notified about future episodes.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Ruben. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.